What if forgotten contract PT3? Harry lie awake in his bed in the guest bedroom of the Bones home trying to figure out why he was fate's plaything. He was 15 years old and for all intents and purposes, engaged to be married to a girl he barely knew at all. Yes, they had spoken a bit, and had started to get to know each other, but one conversation did not a relationship make, and neither of them really wanted to be stuck with the other. Susan had admitted to having deep and strong feelings for Zacharias Smith, who as it turned out, was involved with Harry's best friend, Hermione Granger. Harry on the other hand, while he didn't exactly have any particular girl in mind, didn't want to be with Susan because of some contract written ages before he'd even been born. Harry could admit that Susan was definitely attractive, physically speaking. He had noticed her looks while they'd been talking by the pool the other day. He liked how she had been sitting on one leg, and holding her other leg close to her chest, with her chin resting on her knee. He found that he was, as any normal male would be, drawn to her ample chest, though he found her legs very appealing. Her red locks looked like silk, and her eyes were quite mesmerizing. Susan was a very pretty girl. Of that Harry had no doubts in his hormonal teenage mind. But other than her looks, Harry wasn't really sure what he felt about Susan Bones. She was nice, but she was also a bit pushy. He hadn't really liked the way she had grabbed his hand. He had shown it to after she had come to apologize, and again. He had to admit that it was kind of nice when she held his hand. Harry sighed heavily as he rolled to his side trying to get more comfortable. Everything about his current situation sucked. He couldn't find a single good thing about his predicament. Then he remembered that if it wasn't for this stupid contract, he'd likely still be at Privet Drive without permission to use magic, or access to so many great books on defensive magic. He likely also wouldn't have been given special lessons with an Auror. Harry thought back to his first lesson earlier that day. Tonks had given him a special gift from Mad-Eye Moody. A wand holster that went on his wrist with a quick draw and anti-summoning charm on it. Apparently Moody was still concerned about Harry's buttocks being blasted off. Tonks had made him practice drawing his wand and casting a shield charm as she attacked him with stinging hexes. Harry still had numerous marks on his chest and rear end where Tonks' spells hit him. In the end though, he'd gotten quite good and getting his shield up. Tonks and Harry had eaten lunch together, and Harry had been able to ask all about what an Auror did. Tonks explained that it wasn't all hiding and fighting and chasing dark wizards. Paperwork. Tonks sighed. Mountains of the stuff. We fill out so many reports. I swear I did a report, on filing a report once. It isn't all glamour and glory, kiddo. But, when you do bring a criminal to justice, it is pretty satisfying. Harry had been about to ask how many criminals Tonks had caught when a thin man with what almost looked like a lion's mane for hair came to their table. Auror Tonks. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Director Scrimgeour. Harry, this is Rufus Scrimgeour. He works directly under Amelia Bones in the Department for Magical Law Enforcement. Director Scrimgeour, Harry Potter. It's good to meet you, sir, Harry said as he shook the man's hand. You may be shaking the hand of the next Minister of Magic. Tonks smiled. That's right. Harry said. Madam Bones mentioned you were likely going to be taking Fudge's job after today. Harry said interestedly. I am hopeful. Scrimgeour said as he joined the pair at their table. We will need decisive actions if we are to stop you-know-who. Harry shook his head and sighed disappointedly. Did I say something wrong? Scrimgeour asked, looking mildly insulted at Harry's reaction. Not so much wrong as just, well, forgive me for saying stupid. I beg your pardon. Scrimgeour said. Now getting truly upset. How can you expect to defeat him if you can't even say his name? I swear I've said this too many times to count in just the last few days, but we're only feeding his power by being so afraid of him we can't say his stupid name. It's Voldemort. Several people who were sitting nearby turned to look at Harry with slightly horror-struck looks on the faces. Scrimgeour's anger melted at once, to be replaced by a look of impressed awe. "Kid's right, Director." Tonks chuckled. "Dumbledore's been saying it for years. Yes, he did horrible things, and yes, he's likely to do them again, but we'll never win if we can't save Voldemort. Even if he were killed tomorrow, he'd still have won the war," Harry pointed out. "You make very good points." Scrimgeour nodded. "Tell me, Harry, could I count on you to support the Ministry if I am elected?" "How do you mean?" Harry looked confused. "Well, I think it would be good for morale if you were to be seen popping in and out of the Ministry. Or even if you were to take a few photos with me every now and again," Rufus said in a hopeful tone. "You want to create the illusion that I'm involved." Harry looked puzzled. "Why would it matter if I cared one way or the other, so long as you were doing something to try and end the conflict?" Harry asked. "That may be true, but you are a symbol to our people. A beacon of hope, if you will. If it were known that you were behind the Ministry, it would go a long way to easing people's minds. So would capturing Death Eaters." Harry replied. "It isn't that simple. We live in a world where nearly anything is possible. Can't you put wards around every entrance into the Ministry so that anyone with a dark mark is instantly stunned? I'm sure that could be done. Then, you eliminate any spies within the Ministry. That would go a long way to lifting morale, don't you think?" Harry asked. Scrimgeour sat staring at Harry for several long moments. He sipped his tea several times before he finally nodded as he got to his feet. "You've given me a bit to think about, Harry." "Thank you. I'm glad to help, I just don't want to be anybody's pawn." "I'm not saying that's what you were trying to do. And I apologize if that's what it sounded like. I only wish to help ease the public's mind. As I said, you are a beacon of hope for many." Scrimgeour smiled. Scrimgeour bade them both a pleasant afternoon and left for his next meeting. "Wow, good on you, Harry." Tonks smiled. "I would never say this to him directly, but Rufus is a bit short-sighted sometimes. He's a good man, and I think he's capable of being the minister. But sometimes he doesn't really look at the whole picture. Maybe he will now. That was a good idea about warding the Ministry to detect the dark mark." Tonks applauded softly. "I'm actually surprised it hasn't been done already. Do you think it could be done?" Harry asked. "Possibly. To be honest, the only way it could work was if the minister got a few Aurors to do the work, and didn't bring it up in the Wizengamot or any meetings. It would tip off any Death Eaters who were spies. Not to mention that people would argue over it just to argue about it." "Is it really so hard for people to work together?" Harry asked. "Good question. Let me ask you one in return. Do you think it's possible that Gryffindors and Slytherins could work together?" Harry nearly said yes instantly, but then he thought about it. There was so much animosity between the Lions and the Snakes. So long as people like Malfoy were Slytherins, doing their level best to make life very difficult for people like Harry, there could never be peaceful coexistence between the two houses. "I think I get what you're saying." Harry sighed. "It's a great dream, and maybe someday, but right now, people are far too greedy and self-centered to think about anyone besides themselves, present company not included." Tonks smiled, nudging Harry's shoulder. "So tough guy. You up for a bit more time in our gym?" Harry and Amelia had arrived home that night just as Amy was placing food on the table. Dinner was a quiet affair. Susan and Hannah barely spoke, and Harry was far too tired to try and start any sort of conversation. He gave only monosyllabic answers to anything he was asked. After dinner he'd come up to his room, prepare to fall to sleep, but his mind had other ideas. As soon as he'd lain down, his mind began to work. Images of Susan in a wedding dress, a myriad of unanswerable questions playing over and over. And always the weight of what he was fated to do. Harry decided that he would ask his friends for their advice. Amelia had informed him before they had left the ministry that Ron and Hermione would be visiting him the next day. Harry was really looking forward to seeing his two friends. Usually he had to wait until much later in the summer to visit with them, but now he would be able to see them almost as much as he wanted. As soon as he laid down, his mind went into overdrive, hammering him with thousands of possibilities. Susan walking down the aisle in a stunningly beautiful wedding dress, her eyes shining with happy tears. Facing Lord Voldemort and being unable to stop him from killing his friends. Amelia sobbing over Susan's broken body, blaming him for it all. Susan walking down the aisle with a look of revulsion on her face, Voldemort dead at his feet. All of it repeating in his mind along with hundreds of other less interesting images. With a huge sigh of frustration, Harry knew he needed his friend's input on the matter at hand. Amelia had told him as they were leaving the ministry that evening that both Ron and Hermione would be coming to spend the day with him tomorrow. Harry was very excited about seeing his two friends who had supported him through just about everything. He felt at the moment he had never needed their support more. Hermione Granger received her invitation at just after lunchtime. She was sitting in her back garden enjoying the summer sunshine while she enjoyed a bit of light reading. She had brought a small radio out with her. Hermione had grown to love pop music in the past few years. While she truly enjoyed the magical world, she found the wizarding music was lacking. She sat curled on a lounge chair, with her bare legs curled underneath her as she turned the page. She was trying to absorb what she was reading, but she found herself distracted by the thought of her boyfriend. When she had first met Zacharias Smith, she found him utterly repugnant. He was pompous, foul, and insulting to her and her friends. It was only later that she discovered that he was actually none of those things. He had explained to her why he had acted the way he had at the Hog's Head because Cedric Diggory had been sort of a friend. He did not harbor any real animosity towards Harry, but, not unlike many Hufflepuffs, Zach felt Harry shared some of the blame for Cedric's death. During the meetings, Hermione got to know Zach a bit more, and found him to be engaging and sweet as well as funny. He could make her laugh easily. When she'd awoken in the hospital wing the day after the ministry fiasco, he was sitting by her bed. He claimed that he had grown fond of her, and wanted to know if she would consider dating. Hermione had told him she would have to think it over. Zach clearly had expected it, and gave her all the space she needed. Hermione had spent a very long time mulling it over. In truth, she thought that she might have had feelings for Ron, or even Harry. But after close inspection, and soul-searching, she knew in her heart that while she cared deeply for both of her best friends, the feelings were more of a familiar nature. And so, she had sought out Zach to tell him she would be honored to be his girlfriend. She knew that she'd made the right choice the moment he'd kissed her. Sweet, soft, and utterly amazing. Just a very gentle lingering kiss. He hadn't tried to maul her or anything. Zach was a true gentleman, and Hermione loved how he'd been treating her. They'd spent a bit of time together during the now 2 weeks they'd been out of school, and she'd love every moment of it. Even attending Susan Bones' birthday party. Hermione suspected after speaking to Susan that the redhead held feelings for her boyfriend, but Hermione didn't think that Susan would try to do anything to ruin the relationship. Hermione also suspected something else. Susan had asked a bit about Harry, but that wasn't very unusual. Lots of people asked her about Harry. But there was just something about the way Susan seemed. Nervous. The owl landed with a soft thump and presented its leg. Hermione, rather puzzled, as she had never seen this owl before, took the letter. The owl ruffled its feathers, and settled itself on the table. Hermione gave a questioning look to the bird and then opened the letter. Dear Miss Granger, I would take it if you would be agreeable to come to my home tomorrow to visit with your friend Harry Potter. Please send a reply with this owl to let me know if you will be able to visit. A portkey will be sent to you, and you will be returned to your home by 10 p.m. tomorrow evening. Amelia Bones. Hermione was so shocked that she had to read the letter 3 times. Why is Harry staying with Amelia Bones? She asked the owl, who simply blinked. Rushing into the house, Hermione got ink and quill and wrote that she would be happy to come see her best friend. She tied the letter to the owl and watched it take to the sky. Hermione's mind was full of questions, but she knew she wouldn't get any answers until the next day. In the meantime, she was going to have to try and be patient. Hermione knew in her heart that patience was not one of her strongest virtues. Especially when it was something that was troubling her mind like this. Ron Weasley received his invitation in the early afternoon. He was helping his brother Fred with a very heavy box down the steps to the fireplace. Both Fred and George were moving into their flat that day, and their mother was more than a little distraught. I still don't understand why you can't stay here, she bellowed as George joined them with a bulging suitcase. It's not like we'll never come back. Fred smiled. You know we can't cook. George grinned, and their mother chuckled a bit. They'll be all right, Molly, Mr. Weasley said, smiling proudly at the twins. Bill's already been by and helped put up quite a few protective charms, and he's promised to stop by every couple of days to check on them, and to score himself a few canary creams. George snickered. Owl's coming, Ginny said, pointing out the window. Everyone turned to watch the large gray owl as it soared ever nearer, swooping into the house and landing on Ron's shoulder. Ron, looking puzzled, accepted the letter, and opened it. Dear Mr. Weasley, I would like it if you would be agreeable to come to my home tomorrow to visit with your friend Harry Potter. Please send a reply with this owl to let me know if you will be able to visit. A portkey will be sent to you, and you will be returned to your home by 10 p.m. tomorrow evening. Amelia Bones. What's Harry doing at Amelia Bones' house? Molly said when Ron asked for permission. That's a good question, Mr. Weasley said. It was my understanding that he had to remain at his relatives for at least a month and then he would be coming to stay with us. We saw him with Madame Bones in our shop a few days ago, Fred said. She was interested on a few items that might be used by the Aurors. George smiled. We never did ask why they were together. Fred shrugged. Can I go see him? I'm sure I'll find out what's going on, Ron said. Molly pursed her lips, but nodded. Ron smiled and wrote his reply, which he gave to the owl. The rest of the evening was spent helping the twins, and wondering just why in the world Harry was staying with the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Ron's mother was the most vocal on the subject. Ron was just as curious as the rest of High family about the situation, but he knew that Harry would explain everything the next day. He just hoped there was something good to eat while he was there. Harry went to the garden where his friends were supposed to arrive. Checking his watch, he smiled when it turned to 10 o'clock. Both of his friends appeared out of thin air, landing in heaps on the soft grass. Rough flight? Harry asked with a grin. Harry! Hermione shouted, shooting to her feet and wrapping him in a fierce hug, which Harry returned. Hey mate! Harry smiled as he clasped Ron's shoulder. Good to see you. Ron smiled in return. Harry, what's going on? Why aren't you with your aunt and uncle? Let's go inside, and I'll tell you everything, Harry said, his smile fading a bit. Hermione and Ron looked at each other, both with questioning looks, but they nodded and followed Harry into the house. Harry led them into the sitting room, and they all took seat. And Harry began to tell them of everything that had happened to him in the past few days. Both his friends looked aghast as he explained about the betrothal contract that had been established so long ago. He then told of his feelings on the matter, and how confused he was. He also made a point to tell them about his first real conversation with Susan and Hannah, along with the fact that he was getting a bit of training with Tonks. "Wow, Harry," Ron sighed, finally sitting back in his seat. "I can't believe that one used to be jealous of you." "I'm really sorry, mate." "That's true, but on the bright side, Susan is a very smart and strong witch." "It could have been a lot worse," Hermione pointed out. "And don't think for a second that I'm not thankful for that," Harry said quickly. "But I just don't think I feel anything for her." "Of course not," Hermione replied. "You've just met. I mean, yes, you've gone to school together for the past 5 years, but you've never talked to her until the day. And even then, you didn't talk much, did you?" "No," Harry said flatly. "I would be shocked if you did have any feelings for her one way or another at this point." Hermione smiled gently. "And the cold hard truth is, both of you may never actually fall in love with each other. But there's no reason you can't be friends. Just give it time. Don't try to rush anything. Allow whatever is going to happen in its own time. I think it's brilliant that Dumbledore and Madame Bones allowed you to come here so you would have the opportunity to spend time together. Except, we've only talked that once, and to be honest, I was a little embarrassed. I never knew the Hufflepuffs were such randy buggers." Harry smirked. "Don't be so stupid." Hermione shook her head. "They were right, just because we don't see it, doesn't mean it isn't going on. I happen to know that Seamus and Lavender got pretty physical last year. And both Angelina and Alicia hardly slept in their own beds because they were sharing with Fred and George." "How do you know that?" Ron asked very curiously. Harry's eyes were as big as saucers as Hermione grinned. "Girls talk," she said simply. "From what I've heard, the Hufflepuffs are pretty tame in comparison with the Gryffindors. The Ravenclaws are just as bad. I've even heard a few things about the Slytherins which are rather scandalous." "Speaking of Hufflepuffs," Harry said, scooting forward, "when were you going to tell us about Zach?" Hermione's face instantly turned the color of a ripe tomato. She looked to Ron, who was looking at her curiously. Harry was smiling at her, and she wanted to punch him in the arm for blurting out her private business. "What, did you think we wouldn't approve of him?" Harry asked. Hermione shook her head, and then shrugged. She had to clear her throat a couple of times before her voice would cooperate with her. "Actually, I was a bit afraid of that. Neither of you had a very high opinion of him, not that I blame you. He was rather abrasive." Hermione shrugged. "As I recall, he all but called me a liar." Harry pointed out, his smile faded somewhat. "Yes, but he's sorry about that. I suspect he's probably figuring a way to apologize to you. I'm sure a lot of people are trying to figure out how to do that. But, I got to know him a bit, and he's nothing like how he came off. He's really nice, and I think you'd like him. Most of the reason I didn't tell you is because I knew you'd take the mickey out of me for it." Hermione admitted sheepishly. "Of course we would." Harry smiled brightly again. "But it doesn't mean we wouldn't be happy for you. You're our friend, Hermione, and we want you to be happy. So long as he treats you well and respects you, we have nothing to say on the matter. Right, Ron?" Ron, who remained silent through all this, nodded with a tight smile. Harry knew that Ron harbored some feelings for their female friend, but as he'd never done anything about it, felt no pity for the redhead. If he'd made some sort of attempt to win Hermione's affections, Harry would have felt differently. Harry just hoped Ron wouldn't do something stupid and ruin things for Hermione because he was jealous. "Thank you." Hermione smiled. "He does treat me good. And I can take care of myself, you know." "Never said you couldn't." Harry grinned. "But if he does anything to hurt you, I will make my disappointment clear." Hufflepuffs aren't the only ones who can be loyal. Hermione smiled at Harry's declaration of protectiveness, and began asking questions about Harry's training. The three talked for another hour about all that had been happening to them during the holiday. After lunch, Harry took them on a short tour of the house, lingering in the basement where he spent time practicing magic. Ron and Hermione were quite impressed with the few spells he demonstrated as well as the quick-draw wand holster from Mad-Eye Moody. "Harry, have you thought about continuing the this year?" Hermione asked as the trio went up to the dining room for lunch. "A bit, yeah." Harry shrugged. "I guess it depends on how good a teacher we get." "Why should that matter?" Ron asked. "We could all use extra practice. I know that I would have never managed to get through the owl without the duh, and given what happened at the end of the year, I for one would like to learn more defense. I think a lot more people would be interested in learning from the chosen one." Hermione snickered. "What?" Harry stopped and turned to look at Hermione with surprise. "That's what they're calling you in the Daily Prophet now." "The chosen one." Hermione shrugged. "Why?" "They know that we fought in the Hall of Prophecies." Ron explained. "Someone let it slip that there was a prophecy about you." "Don't worry, nobody knows what it said. They're just trying to write something good, although, I have to admit, I would have liked to have heard too. So we'd know why you know who was so hot to get his scaly hands on it." Harry felt his face get hot, but turned around before his friends could see. He of course knew the contents of the prophecy, but he didn't dare risk telling them. He was too afraid they would simply leave and not wish to be his friends anymore. The mere thought of losing the two people who meant so much to him was so crippling. He felt like someone was crushing his chest. They sat around the table as Amy the house elf finished putting food on the table. Hermione scowled a bit at the retreating elf, and Harry gave her a stern look. "This isn't the place for bringing up house elf rights," Harry warned. "Besides, I have a house elf now." "What?" Ron and Hermione looked up in surprise. "Sirius left me everything he had, and that included Creaker. He's mine now. And Dobby wants to work for me as well." "Oh, you've got to be joking." Hermione sighed as she sat down. "Harry, that's..." "Hermione, I know how you feel, but I can't free Creaker. He knows way too much. Dumbledore suggested I put him to work in the Hogwarts kitchen. And Dobby's a really good elf, and he's helped me a lot in the past, though he's also very nearly killed me," Harry said as he took his seat. "Better watch what you eat this year. If Creaker is cooking." Ron sniggered, and Harry nodded his agreement. "Can we join you?" Hannah asked. She and Susan had appeared and were looking hopeful. Harry looked to his friends, who both didn't look as though they minded. The two girls sat down and began to serve themselves. There was an awkward silence between them all for a few moments until Hermione spoke up. "I'm not sure if I should offer congratulations to you, Susan," she said, looking very awkward. "I can't even begin to imagine how you must be feeling about this. It's been a shock," Susan said politically. "But it's too early to tell anything at this point." Hermione noticed Harry give a quick unreadable glance at Susan. Susan also seemed to be avoiding Harry's eyes. She was overcome by sympathy for these two people. "I just think they should get over themselves." Hannah said flatly. It's been 3 days and they've spoken a grand total of 3 times. It's ridiculous. You can't force people to suddenly have feelings for each other. Hermione said. Oh yes you can. Hannah fired back. Love potions, lust potions, cheering charms. There are ways. But it wouldn't be real. Ron pointed out. But it might get things moving in the right direction. Hannah replied. Don't get me wrong. I want Susan to be happy, I really do, but they're stuck together, and they're both being very stubborn here. Excuse me. Susan looked angrily at her best friend. Maybe you'd like to switch places with me. Then you could be forced to marry someone you don't even know and have to constantly wonder if you're ever going to feel anything for them. And praying that you don't end up hating that person even though you're going to have to marry them and have their baby. Harry spit out the mouthful of milk he was drinking. What? Did they not tell you that part? Susan asked, turning sharp eyes on Harry. Not only do we have to get married, but I have to have your baby within a few years of our wedding. Nice, huh? Susan stood up and threw her napkin on her plate before giving a final glare to Hannah and storming upstairs. Ah cripes. Hannah sighed. I've really got to learn to keep my mouth shut. We really have to have a baby? Harry asked. Yeah, it's part of the contract. The two bloodlines must be merged or some such nonsense. I'd better go talk to her. Hannah started to get up, but Hermione held up her hand. She might be really mad at you. Why don't I try? Okay, but just so you know, when she's upset, she's kind of tough to talk to. She might even try and hit you. I'll be all right. Hermione assured them as she got up. Hermione found Susan on her bed, her face in her pillow. Susan. May I come in? Hermione asked. Susan glanced over her shoulder, her eyes red and teary. She gave a soft shrug, and Hermione stepped into her bedroom, shutting the door behind her. I really am sorry about all of this. I kind of suspected something when we spoke at your birthday party, but I didn't know what. I just sort of figured you had a bit of a thing for Harry. I stopped being a fangirl after I learned Lockhart was a fraud. Susan admitted. She sat up and wiped at her eyes. I'm so lost here. If it's any help, Harry's just as lost. He's absolutely rubbish when it comes to girls. Maybe if his life had been different, he'd be better, but he's never really had the opportunity to obsess over girls like every other boy. Because of Voldemort? Susan asked. Hermione raised a curious eyebrow, but nodded. I see he's already had a bit of influence on you. I don't know anyone other than Harry who could say that name without a bit of a flinch. He explained a bit about Voldemort to Hannah and I the other day. Then I went and screwed things up when I grabbed his hand to see those scars that horrible woman gave him. Hermione grimaced when Susan said this. What? The redhead asked. It's just that. Although he doesn't really mind physical contact, you have to build up to it. Earn his trust, you know. The first time I hugged him, I swear that someone put a body bind hex on him. He went so stiff. I honestly think it may have been the first hug he'd ever gotten. Hermione said honestly. That would explain his reaction. Susan said. But there's more, isn't there? He's so closed off, like he doesn't want anyone getting close to him. Harry's greatest fear is that everyone he cares for will get killed by Voldemort. He tries constantly to push Ron and I away. He thinks he's protecting us, but it's also because he can't believe anyone could care for him enough to be willing to risk their lives fighting at his side, or even for him. He has a bit of a hero complex. He's willing to do anything he can to help others, but refuses to let anyone help him. So your problem is going to be getting past his walls, simply because he's going to want to protect you. Hermione finished. Susan nodded her understanding. All I wanted was to be swept off my feet in a whirlwind romance. Susan huffed. I wouldn't count Harry out. Hermione smiled. Yes, you're pretty much already engaged, but Harry won't be satisfied with that. What do you mean? Susan asked curiously, her anger finally dissolving. Well, I think that deep down, Harry really wants to fall in love with someone. He wants something like his parents had. Now, I'm not saying that you two will have that, because to be honest, you may end up incompatible. It sucks, but there's the chance. I don't think it will happen though, simply because I know Harry. I already know he thinks you're pretty. How do you know that? Susan asked. Hermione grinned and shook her head. The way he watches you. He did it when he was attracted to Cho Chang. His eyes brighten a bit when he's looking at you. I'm sure he's got somewhat friendly feeling towards you. He did tell us about you grabbing his hand, but he didn't sound really hateful when he talked about it. More like he was embarrassed, which I'm sure he was. He doesn't like to show any sort of weakness. Hermione explained. So you think he thinks I'm pretty? Susan asked, and Hermione nodded. He's a 15-year-old boy. And you're a gorgeous redhead with huge, assets. You mean boobs? Susan chuckled. Yeah, okay. Hermione laughed in return. Of course he thinks you're pretty. My advice to you is to take your time with Harry. If you let him, he might actually be the one to sweep you off your feet. And to be honest, I think it would be good for him to have another strong reason to fight. Right now, he's fighting because it's right. But I think he needs something else. Or more specifically, someone to fight for. I wish it were as simple as that. Susan sighed. Why didn't you ever go after him? Hermione shrugged. I wish it were that simple. She smiled, making Susan chuckle a bit. Harry is turning into a very attractive boy, but there's never really been any spark between us. Not romantically anyway. Although, I should warn you. Ron's sister Ginny is probably going to be really broken up when she finds out about you two. She's kind of got this dream that she and Harry will get married one day. Thanks for the warning. Susan smiled softly and took a deep breath and letting it out in a rush. She looked up to Hermione who was watching her. Do you think that we have a chance to actually fall for each other? Susan asked. I believe in my heart that if you can get through his walls, you'll find that he's more than you could have ever hoped for out of a man. He will spend his every waking hour doing all he can to make you the happiest girl in the whole world. Hermione said with a confident smile that made Susan blush as she thought of actually having a very strong and happy marriage with Harry Potter. When Ron arrived back at the Burrow, he felt like he'd just walked into an inquisition. All the Weasleys were waiting for him, with the obvious exceptions of Charlie and Percy. Even Bill's new girlfriend was there, which only made Ron more nervous. His father, Arthur Weasley, sat in his favorite chair, with his wife Molly, sitting beside him in a similar chair. The twins were standing just behind their parents, both with identical eager grins. Ginny sat on the couch next to Bill, who held the hand of his girlfriend Fleur Delacour. How was your day with Harry, son? Mr. Weasley asked, a genuine smile on his face. It was good. Ron said evenly. So why is Harry at Madame Bone's house? Mrs. Weasley demanded. Ron immediately deflated. He'd been expecting this, but he had still held out hope that his mother might just this once, try not to interfere. Now Molly. No, Arthur. I want to know why he's there and not with us where he belongs. After everything that's happened to that poor boy, he deserves, no, he needs to be with people who actually care about him. Mrs. Weasley said quickly before turning sharp eyes on her youngest son. But it wasn't his mother's gaze that made Ron anxious. It was that of his sister, Ginny. Ron knew that Ginny, despite having begun dating Dean Thomas, still had very strong feelings for his best friend. Ron had even held a secret wish for his best friend and his sister to get together. Ron, though he had 5 brothers already, liked the idea of Harry Potter becoming a real member of the family. Ron feared when Ginny heard what had happened to Harry she might do something crazy. "So what happened, Ron?" Bill asked. "About a week ago," Ron started. "Madame Bones got a letter from Gringotts, and it said that there was a betrothal contract for her niece Susan." "Really?" Fleur asked, looking horrified. "I thought marriage contracts were a thing of the past." "I think we all did," Arthur said. "I can't remember the last time I heard of a marriage contract being written up for anyone. The more militant pure-blood families don't even do that anymore. They just encourage their children to marry into similar families. But that doesn't explain why Harry is staying with Madame Bones," Mrs. Weasley said. I think it does," Fred said, looking pointedly at his mother. "Plain as day to me," George affirmed. Mrs. Weasley looked at her twin sons, and then to her husband, then to her oldest son, who gave his girlfriend a rather showy embrace, and finally to Ron. All of whom wore the same expression of understanding. "Oh no," Mrs. Weasley said, her hand going to her mouth in shock. "Harry has to marry Susan Bones." Ginny sputtered, her eyes widening in shock. "You're joking." Ron shook his head. "He explained it all to Hermione and me today." "Neither of them are too happy about it?" "I should think not," Mrs. Weasley said. "Why would Lily and James do such a thing as to write up a marriage contract for their only son, and take away any hope for happiness he might have?" "It wasn't his parents who did it," Ron said quickly. "The contact's been around for like 100 years. Harry said the parameters were never met until now. He said it wasn't even supposed to be for the Potters. It was the family before the Potters. His ancestors or something like that." "Can they get out of it?" Bill asked. Ron shook his head. "Harry said that Madame Bones talked to the goblins about it, but there doesn't seem to be any way to break it. Harry and Susan will be married when Susan turns 19, and then they have to have a baby." "What?" Mrs. Weasley shrieked. Ginny went pale, and her head fell into her hands. "How is Harry taking all of this?" Mr. Weasley said calmly, getting to his feet and busying himself making tea for everyone. "I think he's okay with it," Ron said. "I mean, he's definitely upset, but he's handling it okay for now. He says he's more focused on you-know-who right now. Madame Bones got him special permission to use magic, and he's going to be training with Aurors over the summer." "It's too much," Mrs. Weasley said, shaking her head. "It's too much for him." "Molly, you need to calm down," Mr. Weasley said. "I will not calm down. That poor boy has done more than enough already. It's time we all start thinking about what he wants for a change. He's not even 16 years old, and he's already engaged to be married, against his will, and the world expects him to save them all from you-know-who. It's too much. What about what he wants? What about his dreams? I agree that it is unfair, but what would you have us do?" Arthur asked. "Those old contracts were pretty tough," Bill said. "I imagine that both Harry and Susan could lose their magic if they try to break it. Or they could even be killed over it." Mrs. Weasley stared horrified at her eldest, who did cower a bit under her scorching glare. "You're not helping, Bill," Mr. Weasley said, shaking his head, and using his wife's distraction to put a generous pour of fire whiskey into her cup of tea. "Sorry," Bill said. At that moment, Ginny had enough, and stormed up the stairs, but not before Ron had seen that there were tears in her eyes. Ron's heart sank as he watched her rush past him. "You see," Mrs. Weasley shouted. "Even Ginny's upset." "Yeah, but probably because any hope she had of being married to Harry just evaporated," Fred said darkly. "Oh, stop it." Mrs. Weasley shook her head. "Yes, your sister had a tiny crush on Harry when she was younger, but she's grown up and she's now madly in love with him," George asked. "She's got a boyfriend," Mrs. Weasley pointed out. "If she really liked Harry in that way, I'm sure she would have told him. They would have been dating by now. Except for the fact that she can't speak around him." Fred snickered. "At least not without blushing like a tomato or putting her elbow in butter." George smiled, and Fred laughed at the memory. "She's talked to him loads." Ron defended his sister. "Hermione told me that she was dating other guys so she could get comfortable with herself, and not do stupid things when Harry was about. It was working, too. Ginny's been able to talk to him loads and not giggle or blush or any of that." "You sound like you wanted them to get together," Bill said. "Why not?" Ron said with a shrug. "He's my best friend, and I know he'd treat her right. I know it's her choice and all, but I just hoped, you know." "I think we all did." Mr. Weasley smiled. "I've never in my life met as remarkable a young man as Harry Potter, and it would have been nice to welcome him to our family in that way." "Oh, she must be so broken-hearted," Mrs. Weasley said, looking to the ceiling to where her only daughter was likely curled up on her bed, crying her eyes out. "I had no idea she still felt so strongly for Harry." "That's only because you don't get to go with us to Hogwarts and watch how she watches him," George said. "Only an idiot wouldn't have been able to tell." Fred nodded. "So what do we do?" Mrs. Weasley asked, looking to her husband. "We support Harry just as we always have," he said firmly. "He's family, no matter what, and we always support our family." Everyone nodded their agreement at Mr. Weasley's declaration. 4 days had passed since Harry had seen Ron and Hermione, and he was missing them terribly. A tension had begun to build between Harry and Susan in the days following the revelation that not only did they have to get married, but have a baby as well. Harry had taken to hiding out in his bedroom or the basement where he'd practice new spells until he was too exhausted to stand. When Harry did encounter Susan, he felt uptight and panicky. It wasn't fear as he'd experienced it before. It wasn't like standing before Voldemort knowing your life was about to end. This was different. This was actually worse. It didn't help that Harry's hormonal teenage mind was beginning to plague him with images of Susan in the cut-off shorts and tank top he'd seen her in on that first day they had actually spoken. He'd awaken every morning with the typical teenage problem, and he could remember that he'd been dreaming of Susan in those cut-offs. Harry was just far too confused about everything, and just didn't want to deal with this problem. He convinced himself that the Voldemort problem was far more important, and that he needed to worry about that before he could even think about figuring out things with Susan. The last thing either of them needed was for her to be sucked into Harry's troubles. Harry sat on the floor of the basement of the Bones house, breathing heavily after nearly an hour of work on a very powerful piercing hex. Harry thought it would be a very useful spell, especially if he could aim it correctly. A spell like that could stab a Death Eater through the heart. That would end a duel pretty fast, Harry had thought after reading up on the spell. You've been working pretty hard. Harry jumped. He hadn't heard Susan come down the stairs. She was standing in the doorway, using it to support herself as she leaned inside. She was wearing a short denim skirt and another tank top which only served to remind Harry she was a very buxom young woman. She wasn't wearing shoes, which Harry had noticed that she seemed to enjoy. Hannah was similar. Neither girl seemed to bother with shoes of any kind while around the house. Harry wondered if it was a girl thing. Susan's hair was piled on top of her head, with a few fiery strands falling into her face. Harry thought she looked very pretty, but then scolded himself that he couldn't think like that. At the same time, a small part of his mind was questioning why he couldn't admire Susan's looks. "I have to work hard," Harry said finally as he began to settle down. "I can't rely on luck to get me out of every situation. I need to have some skill as well." "I think you've got that in spades," Susan said, blushing as she spoke. She leaned into the room a bit more, hanging on the sides of the doorway. She glanced around the room a bit as if looking for anything to talk about. "Thanks, but it isn't enough," Harry sighed. He was beginning to feel the strange knots in his stomach that seemed to appear whenever Susan was around. Usually, Harry would just escape if he found himself potentially alone with her, but right now, she was effectively blocking his only escape. "What are you working on now?" Susan asked, taking a step into the gym area. Her hands dropped to her sides, and she stood watching him nervously. "Piercing hex," Harry said, sliding the book towards Susan, who bent to pick it up. Harry couldn't help notice how it looked like her breasts might fall out of her top. He quickly looked at his shoes to avoid being embarrassed, or embarrassing Susan should it actually occur. "Looks complicated," she said after a moment of reading. "Have you managed it?" "Yeah." Harry nodded, and motioning towards the practice dummy. "I just can't aim it right. I've been trying to focus it, but I just can't get it right." "You will," Susan said with a soft smile. "But maybe you should take a break. You've been working really hard for the past few days, and it can't be good for you. Why not come out by the pool with me and Hannah?" "I can't. I don't have the luxury of just sitting by the pool wasting time and gossiping," Harry said sternly. "We don't gossip," Susan said quickly. "Whatever," Harry responded, getting to his feet. "I have to learn all that I can. Voldemort wants me dead, and he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. What does it matter if he tries to kill you if you don't even bother to live your life?" Susan pointed out. "I do," Harry replied. "No you don't," Susan snapped. "All you've done since you got here is read and practice. That's not living. The only time that you've actually done anything outside of reading and practicing was when Hermione and Ron were here. The whole point of you coming to stay here was so that we could try to get to know each other, and honestly it feels like all you've done is try and avoid me. It's a bit insulting. I mean, you're a boy, aren't you supposed to be trying to figure some way to see me naked at least?" Harry blushed, but countered quickly. "Look, I know you probably don't understand any of it, but I've got to train. I have to be ready for anything. Who's to say he won't come storming into this house at any time? He's got spies everywhere and they all have one purpose, find me so he can kill me. He's been trying to do me in for years. I'm not denying any of that, Harry, but what happens if you do defeat him? What then? If you don't stop and take time to be normal, when it's all over you'll have nothing. It will have all been for nothing. When Voldemort is finished for good, then we can figure things out between us," Harry said flatly. Susan's eyes burned with anger. Harry suddenly had the suspicion he'd just said the wrong thing. So, your plan for this whole problem is to wait and hope it goes away. Susan's eyes narrowed, and Harry shuddered. That's not what I meant. It sure sounded that way to me. You want to ignore me and our little problem. Are you hoping that he'll kill you so you won't have to deal with me at all? Susan said coldly. Harry just stood there looking at her confused and irritated. He tried a few times to argue, but he just couldn't think of anything to say that would make things better, or at least calm the redhead down a bit. Susan stared at him for several long minutes before she straightened up and squared her shoulders. Fine, she said. If this is the only way to get you to interact with me, then fine. What? Harry asked, watching Susan cross the room where she turned to face him. I've been trying to figure out some way over the last few days for you and I to try and build some kind of rapport with each other and try to at least open communication. But since your entire focus seems to be on training, then we'll train. Susan pulled her wand out of her back pocket and raised it towards Harry. But you don't have permission. Harry protested. In response, Susan sent a stinging hex at Harry, hitting him in the arm. Harry yelped as he grabbed his now throbbing shoulder. I got it yesterday. Her blue eyes burning with anger. Let's see if all your practicing has been worth anything. Harry's wand was up and conjuring a shield as Susan sent 2 more stinging hexes his way. I don't want to hurt you. Harry tried, but Susan wasn't listening. She sent a spell at Harry's head, which he ducked just in time. Do I have your attention now, Harry Potter? She snapped. Fine. Harry said. He took a deep breath and gripped his wand a bit tighter. If Susan wanted to duel, then he'd duel her. Harry was actually happy about it. He knew he needed a human target to work with. Dummies didn't fire back, or move. He fired a tripping jinx, which Susan hopped over easily. Really? Is that your plan? To trip Riddle? Susan asked with a wry look of disdain. She fired back with a leg locker curse, which Harry sidestepped, and retaliated with a body bind jinx. Susan did a very graceful pirouette to avoid it, and sent a cutting hex at Harry, which grazed his cheek. Harry hissed in pain, and Susan looked triumphant. Harry lost his temper then, and began firing a series of jinxes at Susan, who could only conjure a shield charm. It was then that Susan realized how huge a mistake she'd made. Yes, Harry had made her angry with his reasoning that their situation could wait. He'd made it sound as if she was unimportant to him, and for some reason that had really upset her. But, now she knew that she should have just walked away. There was a reason they had all gone to Harry to learn defense. He was good. He was really good, and she knew that he'd been going easy on her. He'd likely been happy to have someone to duel against, as all he had to work with was practice dummies. And Susan knew she was no slouch when it came to magic. She was usually pretty inventive and powerful, but she knew that she was nothing when compared to Harry. Harry had avoided all of her spells, and even looked as if he'd been enjoying this little tiff, but then she'd landed a lucky hit and he'd gotten really angry. All she could do was conjure the strongest shield she could and cower behind it until he wore himself out. But then her shield exploded and she was hit in the chest with a very powerful bludgeoning hex that sent her across the room. Her head slammed into the wall, and she saw black. She's starting to come around, Amelia said. Oh, thank goodness. Hannah sighed. What happened? Susan asked as she opened her eyes and found herself in her own bed with what felt like a ton of bricks on her chest. Her aunt was sitting next to her with a light smile on her face, and she removed the cold cloth from Susan's head. From what I gathered, Amelia smiled as she helped Susan sit up. You and Harry just had your first difference of opinion, and if I'm not much mistaken, I think he won this round. Susan coughed as her chest tightened. She gave a questioning look to her aunt, who smiled tightly. He hit you with a bludgeoning hex and freaked out when he saw that he'd really hurt you. He admitted to being angry at you, but he never intended to really hurt you. He's been locked up in his room for hours, afraid to even look at me. I thought he really had killed you, Hannah said. She was sitting on her bed looking quite relieved to see her friend awake. He looked so scared when he came to get help. Fortunately for you, there wasn't any serious damage. Amy Fla called me and I came right home and was able to patch you up pretty well. You're probably going to be pretty tender for a few days though. Why can't I go to St. Mungo's and get healed? Then I'll be okay right away, Susan asked. Amelia simply shook her head. Because I think you both needed to learn a little lesson here. Harry needed to learn that he can't just ignore his problems, no matter what they are. And you, my sweet niece, had to learn not to push people. Amelia smiled. Hannah told me that you were a bit tired of Harry ignoring you and that's what started this whole thing. But you said the whole reason Harry was here was so we could get to know each other. He's been here nearly a week and we've only talked once. Susan winced as she tried to sit up further. Yes, but forcing your company on him is only going to push him away from you. Understand that unlike other boys Harry's age, he's got quite a bit resting on his shoulder. More than he probably even knows. You have to allow him time to adjust to the fact that you two are going to be married. And you need to adjust to the idea as well, Amelia said, giving a pointed look to her niece. Why can't this be easy? Susan sighed. You're not getting married right away, Amelia pointed out. Take your time, and let him and yourself have the chance to process things. Yes, I would like it if you could get to know each other, but there's no need to force it. I keep telling you this. There was a knock on the door, and Hannah opened it to find a very pale and skittish-looking Harry waiting. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and his eyes were cast down to his shoes. He looked like a beaten dog, and Hannah actually felt bad for the boy. Is she all right? He asked in a very soft voice that was heartbreaking to hear. It was clear that Harry was feeling an immense amount of guilt over what he'd done. Why not ask her yourself? Hannah said, opening the door wider. We'll leave you two to talk, Amelia said, standing up. She nodded Hannah out the door, and the blonde let out an exasperated sigh before being led out of Susan's bedroom. Harry stood next to the now closed door, looking at his shoes, while Susan stared at him expectantly. It was obvious to Susan that Harry wanted to leave as well, but his guilt kept him there to accept the consequences of his actions. I'm sorry, Harry said, his voice just above a whisper. I lost my temper, and I just... It's okay, Susan said. I started it. I knew better than to pick a fight with you, but I was upset, and I wanted you to hurt as much as you hurt me. I didn't mean to hurt you, Harry said, still unable to look at Susan, who was sitting up fully, though she was holding her chest. I know that now. Susan nodded. It's just that, well, this whole contract business is really stupid, and we're both stuck together, and it just seemed like you didn't want to bother getting to know me. I do, Harry said, now looking up. But, I just don't want you, or anyone else getting hurt for me. Too many people have suffered, and I just can't. Harry, I know other people have told you this, so this probably won't be anything you haven't heard before. You are not the center of the universe. Riddle is going to kill loads of people because he's evil. Yes, he's got some sort of obsession with you, but it doesn't mean the rest of us will be safe if we ignore you, or shun you. If we oppose him in any way, we're going to be killed for it. So get over yourself and let people fight. It's their right to stand against him if that's what they choose. Harry looked at her, a bit awed by her bravado. Actually, no one's ever really put it to me like that, he said after several moments of silence. They both began chuckling, but it ended when Susan winced badly. Harry started to cross the room towards her, but stopped quickly when he realized he had no idea what he would do when he got to her. Susan had noticed his movement, and smiled to herself. "I'll be okay," she assured him, and he simply nodded, though he looked unconvinced, and still upset over it all. "I really am sorry. And I said it was my fault," Susan said quickly. "Let's just drop it before we end up trading spells again." Harry nodded, his hands going into his pockets for lack of anything to do or say. "I thought about what you said earlier," Harry said, looking at his shoes again. "Which part?" Susan asked. "The part about having nothing to show for my life." Harry sighed. "The truth is that I do want to be married and to have a family. But if I don't take time for myself, then how can I expect to have those things?" "What are you saying?" Susan asked, thinking she already had a good idea. "Maybe we should go on a date, or something," Harry said very quickly. "I know that we're already going to be married, but, well, it just seems wrong that we don't do any of the other stuff normal people do. So, let's have a date." "A date?" Susan asked, looking skeptical, though inside she was actually very pleased. "Like dinner, a show, long conversations." "Yeah. We can go somewhere, and pretend that there's no contract. Let's go on a date and just try to, get to know each other," Susan asked. Harry nodded, though he still wasn't looking at her. "Harry, how can you expect to take me on a date if you won't even look at me?" she asked. Harry looked up at her, and shrugged. "I'm still ashamed of what I did to you," he admitted. Susan got to her feet, and closed the distance between them. Gently she lifted his chin so he was looking into her eyes. "I already told you, it was my fault. I forgive you. Now let's move forward, all right?" Harry nodded his head, and she smiled at him. They stared at each other for a long time, and Susan was suddenly overcome with an urge that she'd only had for one other boy. But in that moment, Harry Potter looked so vulnerable and open to her. Staring into his green eyes, she swore she could see his soul laid bare to her, and it was beautiful. Her body was screaming for her to close the short distance between them and to take his lips with hers. "So, a date then," she said, taking a step back as if she'd be shocked. She let out a breath she had been unaware of holding. There would be plenty of opportunities to kiss Harry if things in the future. He didn't need some rabid fangirl falling over themselves to get his affection. And Susan was not some slag who jumped into bed with any old bloke. Yeah," Harry stammered. "Here's an idea," Susan said, sitting down again, and motioning for Harry to sit next to her by patting her bed. Harry slowly came and sat down next to her, though he did keep a bit of space between them. "Why don't we go out with a few friends? Try and make it a bit more comfortable. We'll ask Hannah and Hermione to come with us, and they'll bring their boyfriends. Then it will be like a triple date or something. Then it might not be as awkward, and we might have a bit of fun," Susan suggested. Harry's face lit up and he nodded. There was a knock on the door and Hannah poked her head in the bedroom, sighing and looking disappointed. Susan could tell that her blonde friend was hoping that maybe today's events might have led to Susan and Harry falling into each other's arms and snogging until they could no longer breathe. If only she could read minds. Susan thought to herself. Your aunt told me to come get you both. Dinner is ready, Hannah said. Harry was on his feet as if he'd been hit in the bottom by another stinging hex. He rushed out of the bedroom, leaving Susan and Hannah. Didn't even offer to help you or anything. Hannah looked irritated. No, but he asked me on a date, Susan said, tenderly standing up again. Hannah did a double take, her mouth falling open. No, he didn't, she said quickly. Yes, he did. Susan smiled. Apparently, I managed to get through that thick skull of his before he nearly killed me. When are you going? Hannah asked, excitement flowing off of her. We didn't get a chance to hammer out details, but you'll need to write to Neville and see if he'll join us. Huh? Hannah looked confused. Susan explained it all as they headed down the stairs, and by the time they got to the dining room, Hannah was excited all over again. That sounds like a lot of fun, and I think you're right, it will make things a bit easier. Hannah agreed. So, after dinner, I'll write Neville, and you and I can figure out what to do and where to go. Where are you going? Amelia asked as the girls entered. Harry and Susan are going on a date, and Neville, Hermione, Zach, and I will be tagging along. Hannah explained. Harry, who was sitting at the table, blushed scarlet. He kept his eyes on his plate as Amelia looked in his direction, the hint of a smile on her face. Well, before you do anything, let me know what, when and where, Amelia said, and the girls both agreed. Harry kept his word, and made time to spend with Susan over the next couple of days. Susan came down to watch him practice a few times, but didn't attempt to practice with him, as she was still quite tender. Other times, when he was practicing, or with training at the ministry with Tonks, Susan and Hannah were busy putting together a plan for a triple date. Neville had written back that he would love to go out with Hannah and the others. Zach also wrote that he would love to join his housemates on a date. The girls then went on to plan the day's activities. Amelia's only real conditions for the teens to go out was that they stay together, and stay out of Diagon Alley. The girls promised that they would abide by her conditions. Hannah and Susan had asked Hermione to come early, so they could all prepare together. Susan thought it would be a good opportunity to get to know the bookworm of Gryffindor better. Hermione had already provided useful advice in dealing with Harry, which Susan had all but ignored, and paid the price for. Susan vowed to listen to Hermione's advice in the future. Susan and Hannah greeted Hermione when she arrived, and the three girls went to Susan's room. So, how'd you get him to ask you out? Hermione asked when they were safely ensconced in Susan's room. She let him use a bludgeoning hex on her. Hannah smirked. What? Hermione looked confused. They had a fight, Hannah said, trying to clear up the confusion. I kind of ignored your advice, and we had a little disagreement, Susan said sheepishly. It wasn't really a big deal. No, he almost killed you, but it was nothing. Hannah rolled her eyes. He what? Hermione's jaw fell to the floor. She's exaggerating, Susan said. 5 broken ribs is not exaggerating, Hannah replied, her hands on her hips. Okay. Time out. Start from the beginning, Hermione said, sitting on Hannah's bed. The next 2 hours were spent getting ready for their date, and explaining to Hermione all about what had been happening over the past week. Hermione was so engrossed that she even allowed Hannah to do her hair and makeup. And then he just asked you on a date? Hermione asked, making sure she was getting everything right. She was adjusting her shirt and making sure it was buttoned correctly. The weather promised to be very warm and all three girls had chosen to wear shorts and some form of sandals. Hermione wore a light blue blouse over a plain white camisole. Hannah was a bit less reserved. She was wearing a simple black tank top which revealed plenty of cleavage, thanks to her electric blue bra. Like I said, I must have gotten through his thick skull. Susan shrugged as she gave herself one last look in the mirror. Do I look casual enough? Yes. Hannah sighed with exasperation. Shorts, sandals, tank top with the button-up shirt. You're fine. I still think you should have worn the skirt, though. You look just fine. Hermione said. Besides, this is about you two getting a chance to be normal. Just keep things simple, and don't talk about Voldemort or anything like that. I know. Susan sighed. But I can't help feeling this like. I don't know. Susan had not mentioned to either Hannah or Hermione about that moment where she had wanted to kiss Harry. It still haunted her, and she couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd been looking at her. She and Harry had talked a bit here and there over the last couple of days, but Susan felt as if Harry's walls were back in place. She also felt her own guard was back up. This was going to be rather awkward for her, as she was going to be going out with the boy she still had deep feelings for and his girlfriend, and the boy she was supposed to be marrying. She hadn't given it much thought before now, but as the date loomed closer, it was beginning to affect her. Miss Amy, the house elf said as she popped into Susan's room. Misters is here in the sitting room. Neville. Hannah said as she darted for the door. Hermione grinned at Susan, who shook her head. I guess we better head down, too. Susan said, and Hermione smiled as she got up and they followed Hannah downstairs. They found Hannah with her arms wrapped around Neville, who looked a bit overwhelmed, though quite pleased at the same time. Susan did have to admit that Neville was growing to be somewhat attractive. A lot of his baby fat had disappeared, and his face didn't look so rounded anymore. It probably helped that he had shot up a few inches this past year. Susan thought she even spotted a bit of stubble on his face. Susan had to admit that even though Neville didn't appeal to her romantically speaking, he was actually becoming fanciable. Zack and Harry were simply looking at one another awkwardly. Harry had his hands in his pockets as usual, while Zack looked fidgety. Hermione greeted her boyfriend with a gentle kiss and introduced Zack and Harry properly. Look, Harry. I feel like I owe you a major apology for everything I said and did. Forget it. Harry said quickly. Consider this a fresh start, all right. Zack smiled gratefully, and Hermione gave Harry a very proud smile. So, you and Susan? Zack asked, looking between Harry and his date, who stood to the side rather nervously. When did that happen? It hasn't really happened. Harry said, looking towards Susan. This is sort of a get-to-know-each-other kind of thing. Oh. Zack said, clearly confused. Shall we go? Hannah asked. I'm hungry. She took Neville by the hand and began leading him towards the door. Hermione and Zack followed, hand in hand. Wow, I feel weird. Harry said, watching the two couples. Susan was at his side and she gave him a soft smile. You can hold my hand if it'll make you feel more comfortable, she said. Will it make you feel comfortable? He asked. Susan gave an odd sort of half shrug and Harry nodded. Yeah. Why don't we take it one step at a time, and not worry so much about them? That could work. Susan smiled. After you. Harry said, motioning that she should lead them out the door. Susan smiled nervously again, and with Harry just behind her, they joined the other two couples who had just signaled for the night bus. Please like and subscribe.